Good evening and welcome to the first and only vice presidential debate of this election cycle, sponsored by the BUSA Bulletin. Please join me in welcoming the candidates to the stage. I'm DeMarcus Washington of CNN News, and I will be the moderator of this hour-long event. We have 1 hour reserved exclusively for a serious debate on issues that matter most to American voters. Candidates will have 1 minute and 30 seconds for answers and an opportunity for a closing statement. Follow-ups will be at the discretion of myself, the moderator. Invoking a candidate's name or policy does not necessarily mean the mentioned candidate is entitled to a response. We want to caution all of the candidates not to interrupt or speak over your fellow debaters. If you talk over each other, voters cannot hear you. Considering the issues we're facing, we want voters to get the chance to hear everything you have to say. Continued interruptions may result in a loss of additional questions throughout the debate. And to our audience, please hold your audience so that the candidates can be heard. With that said, let's have a good debate. The first topic tonight is what separates each of you from the other. Vice President Cromwell, what do you believe is the most important separating issue of this campaign? I'll repeat. The first topic tonight is what separates each of you from the other. Vice President Cromwell, what do you believe is the most important separating issue of this campaign?
Well, of my campaign, I have been doing this. I have been putting the American people first. And while the other two people here to my left and to my right may come here tonight, they have not really done much work for the American people. Dwayne Fitzgerald, he decided to wait a month and let his election certificate expire rather than getting up, taking his oath, and doing his job. John Johnson over here to my left decides to talk about inactivity. However, inactivity plagued his own party, his own Senate, and his own Department of Homeland Security. I, on the other hand, I have been putting in the work. I've been doing all of it. We've redone the businesses. We're still working on them. We're restarting LIA. We're getting people back to the courts very soon, and that is exactly what this country needs.
Secretary Johnson, your response?
Listen, the Senate Democratic Conference was also inactive while Mrs. Cromwell was vice president and has been through this entire Congress. Immediately within my first 3 weeks, I will hold a business conference with business leaders across the nation to allow for ideas to go around for the executive's policies about businesses. And Mr. Dwayne, while he has good intentions, he is not fit for the vice presidency.
And Mr. Fitzgerald, your response?
Well, I'd like to open by saying Miss Cromwell does like to use the past against other candidates, so I'd like to open up by saying that
The
it
past
wasn't
is
that
always the future.
it wasn't that long ago that she decided to leave us for starting, I think it was Liechtenstein, uh, just because she lost the vice presidential election. So, if you'd really like to use our pasts, there are plenty of cards I can take out of my sleeve.
Leaving has no effect on this race, but your activity and what you do as a government official here has everything to do with how you will perform as vice president. Let's get that right.
Yes, but I believe that leaving the entire country and betraying a nation is a lot more severe than being inactive.
There's a difference between betraying the country and actually putting in the work and effort for them, which you have no clue of how to do.
So, um, you seem to be latching on to this idea that myself a month ago is me now. So I'll be latching on to the idea that you, when you left BUSA, the petty, the not really caring for the American people's opinion, but simply caring that you had lost the election. I'll just think that you, that's you right now, that you are
All right,
speaking as that person.
Mr. Fitzgerald, we're going to move on from that topic. There's many other topics we have to cover tonight. Our next topic is the lack of activity. Secretary Johnson, your tenure as Secretary of Homeland Security and Senator was met with criticism. Vice President Cromwell claims your department was plagued with inactivity. Your response?
So, the Department of Homeland Security is a very tough department to run, as we don't have a lot of stuff to do. Citizenship is completely separate from, DHS. It's a separate government entity. So it's harder to get people in because there's not that much stuff to do at DHS, apart from FEMA. In the Senate, I led multiple issues and had a very great record in the Senate of attending sessions and stuff like that. In an activity in America, we have to get events. We need to, because we're falling behind everybody. And if we don't get events soon, we're gonna fall behind too far. It's gonna be too late to bounce back.
And Mr. Fitzgerald, your response?
My response to what question?
Secretary Johnson's tenure as Secretary of Homeland Security and as Senator was met with criticism. Do you have any comment on that?
While I must admit that Mr. Johnson may not have had the most active department BOSA has ever seen, it can kind of be said that the Democrats honestly were just out to get him simply due to his Republican affiliation.
And then on to Vice President Cromwell. Your response?
Well, firstly, I want to know what he led in. We did not see him leading in any department. We did not see him leading in the Senate when the Republicans refused to introduce legislation that was vital to America. Who decided to introduce legislation and pass it? Democrats. We show up to the sessions, we write the legislation, we pass it, and then we send it on to the president to get it signed.
But how much of it does anything?
A lot of it, actually. And in reference to his department, he claims there was nothing to do. I can name maybe 2 or 3 things right now off the top of my head. Press conferences, maybe actually submitting your progress reports on time. And let's go on. Maybe identification cards. It's not on USCIS to do that. It would be, again, on the Department of Homeland Security. So all I hear when he speaks is excuses.
I disagree with Vice President Cromwell. I was the first person almost every time during the White House to submit progress reports to the Vice President, in fact. I was working on identification cards before my resigning to focus on my campaign. I mean, in the Senate, I was president pro tempore for 9 months and minority leader for 2 months. Republicans got stuff done while Democrats sat and did nothing during my term in the Senate.
You want to tell me what getting stuff done refers to? Because I sure didn't see it, and neither has America.
Vice President Cromwell, we have one more question regarding activity, so we'll move on to that. Mr. Fitzgerald, you failed to introduce legislation as a United States Senator. While Secretary Johnson proposed 3 pieces of legislation, Vice President Cromwell proposed 8 pieces of legislation, and you only proposed 1. Can the voters trust you to serve with activity as Vice President?
Well, I'd like to open up by saying that my tenures as senator were not as successful as theirs. That is a fact. I can admit that. But I'd also like to mention the fact that at the time when I was a senator, I was not nearly as experienced as I am today with BUSA legislation, with with holding political office, or with any sort of representation of the people. Now, I believe that I have the capacity to hold this office, and my past self does not represent my current self. I mean, I'd like to reference my argument earlier. How Miss Cromwell earlier, even if it was like a year ago or so, she did leave BUSA. I truly do not consider that representative of herself. out of respect to her person and her own abilities.
And
But
Vice President Cromwell, your response to that?
Well, I first want to say why he complains he didn't know anything about the Senate. We always offered to help. It was just a matter of reaching out across party lines, no matter
never
what.
did such a thing.
It was
You never did
it
such a
was all you needed to do was ask. That's all you had to do.
You never
And
offered.
while you were sitting there and complaining that you didn't know anything and that your tenure as senator was not all too good, maybe it's in reference because you were too focused on running a nuclear the a nuclear organization, which you still continue to run. So if what's telling us that you are going to take any time away from that to serve as vice president?
Well,
I want
what's
to give Secretary Johnson a chance to respond to the question. Any comment on your 3 pieces of legislation proposed during your Senate tenure?
I'm gonna be very short about this. I didn't propose that much legislation. I'm gonna be honest about it. But I
And can
helped
we please
pass
make
many
sure he knows it was copy and paste for most of it?
They were not copy and paste, Mrs. Cromwell. I worked to pass many legislation that
Basic
was
resolutions
bipartisan
are always
between
copy and paste.
Democrats
It's
and
been introduced
Republicans.
100 times
Vice President
before.
Cromwell, please give Secretary Johnson his time to respond to the question at hand.
Mr. Washington? If possible, I'd like to speak after Johnson.
All right,
We
thank
can
you.
make that happen. Secretary Johnson?
I worked out on, and we worked with Democrats to pass bipartisan legislation that benefited America and both sides. Even though I didn't pass that much, I worked a lot in the Senate to help American families succeed and continue the American dream to be a possibility in these trying times.
Uh, let's see. Mr. Fitzgerald, we're going to move on to one more question regarding activity, and you can speak then. Vice President Cromwell, many could argue that your tenure has been an example of a downgrade in our nation. With the lack of executive action under the Trump-Cromwell administration, why should the voters re-elect you?
Look, as vice president, it's not easy to convince several different people in several different departments within the administration to actually do something. While you can put pressure on them, it's not always that simple. The vice president truly has no oversight or ability over any secretary in the executive branch outside of them being acting president, which in this case I am not. And I have discussed this with Donald and the White House Chief of Staff. We are hosting events and we are trying to get the Senate back on track. We are looking for candidates to fill empty seats. We are letting them come in and do meetings with us. And by the way, we will be hosting the the second Senate session, to be exact, tomorrow night, after we just recently ousted the Senate Majority Leader who was clearly inactive.
All right. And then Mr. Fitzgerald, your response? We're going to move on to Secretary Johnson first, and then we'll do Fitzgerald.
During
You
my
had something to add.
I led in the Senate. During my term in the Senate, we just did a lot of stuff that benefited. As president pro tempore, the Senate was barely ever inactive, and there was multiple sessions. It should not be 2 sessions. Should not be the standard for the Senate. This is a chamber that I've loved since I joined BUSA, but while this inactivity continues, I just don't know what to think of it. We need to get it back on track. And I do support Mrs. Cromwell for at least trying to get it back on track. And I think that every candidate on the stage, if elected, should try to get the Senate back on track.
And then Mr. Fitzgerald?
Well, I'd like to open up by saying that Miss Cromwell is only currently the vice president because the election screwed up. Now, honestly, we have known since the start that Democrats cannot deliver. I mean, sure, they may have introduced more legislation.
Good evening, and welcome to the first and only vice presidential debate of this election cycle, sponsored by the BUSA Bulletin. Please join me in welcoming the candidates to the stage.
For Black History Month, for a month in the Senate to be celebrated. I mean, that's something we always did. Just putting it on paper, sure, that that makes the Democrats look good, but that's not something that's it's like the basic concept of inflation. Quality over quantity. It, it's all about quantity with the Democrats, and it shows.
Vice President Cromwell, a very quick response to that before we move on to the next topic.
Well, to be frank, there that simple resolution was just a formality, and it was to acknowledge and make it fact. And not to mention that also lifts a disqualification on a former vice president. Now, why some of us may not agree with it necessarily, it still happened. It's still going to happen.
It's
And
not a matter of
I
agreement. It's a matter
and
of
Thank you.
while
Thank you.
you want to sit there and talk
We'll
about
move on to the
legislation, that's
next
more than you ever
we'll move on to the next
proposed.
topic. We have a lot of topics to cover, so we're going to move on to the next topic of innovative solutions. Mr. Fitzgerald, this question is for you. Given the challenges faced by the nation, what innovative solutions can you propose that go beyond traditional approaches, considering the unique limitations of our game environment?
So I honestly think that BUSA has plenty of good people in it. The citizens are perfectly good people, and there are plenty of good people who are willing to occupy positions, but simply need somebody to reach out there and tell them that this is easier than you think. Now, we've always tried just the average ping, the average just send out messages saying, oh, you can do this. But I think it's about time that we start reaching out to individuals, that we start opening programs that'll show people what they're going to do. And instead of just saying, oh, you can come do this, we're going to show them what they're going to be doing when they come do this. Uh, now, this isn't exactly a completely developed idea, but we really need to start being proactive as a government because obviously what we're doing is not working, and we can't just use that as an excuse.
Vice President Cromwell, your response?
Well, he talks about all that, but he still doesn't have a fully developed plan. He has been running for vice president for
Okay, you
almost
you
a
give me
week now.
you give me a fully developed plan then, because you're holding the office, aren't you? Well, let's hear.
Well, what we're doing is we're going in, especially for businesses right now, we're going through, I'm talking to business leaders, we're renewing their licenses. We are going to be hosting a business conference later this month.
Right,
And
but
we are
what are you doing
also
about the Supreme Court? What are you doing about the Supreme Court? What about
we are
literally
hosting
everything else?
we are hosting Law Institute of America classes for people to come and get their law degree so then we can then send them to the courts. We are very much focused on the courts. And that is one of the biggest parts of our country. We are putting the courts first.
How many
And
people are in the
Secretary
LAA currently?
Johnson, any comment?
I partially agree with Mr. Fitzgerald. We both agree on many things that I think about policy. We're both old-fashioned conservatives in terms of policy. We do need we do need new solutions. And what's working right now is not working. The White House needs to change its policies as soon as either as soon as I'm elected, we will change our policies in innovative sectors. Because right now nothing's working. Nothing really is. And it's a mess.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Our next topic is the economy and jobs. Secretary Johnson, we're going to begin with you. The nation is currently grappling with a poor economy and a high unemployment rate. 26% of Americans reported on the census that they were unemployed, an increase from 18% just 4 months ago. How do you plan to address these issues, and what specific policies will you implement to stimulate economic growth and create more jobs? And that question goes to Secretary Johnson.
Well, thank you, Demarcus. Economically, we are failing. We are failing across the board, and countries like Buck and other communities, they're already above us. And I mean, we have to get back in the spot to where people want to come to BUSA because businesses are thriving, jobs are plentiful, and people don't want to go into jobs right now because our economy is bad. If I'm elected, I will make sure to constantly keep in contact with business owners to change executive policies about economics. And I think that we also need to consider, doing budget cuts. I mean, our budget right now with less budget, we can put this more towards businesses and our economy, which we could really need right now.
And Vice President Cromwell, your response?
Well, honestly, trying to listen to him, I got a little confused because everything that comes out of his mouth is just a mess. But the economy in BUSA, we're looking for businesses. We're getting ready to launch a completely new application that will organize everything. We will be having a new system put in place for registration so people can go in and they'll be able to fully see who owns what businesses, when they're, what their server links are, and what they're doing. We're not just going to sit here and give you a false plan that is half orchestrated. We're going to put in the work. We're putting in the work.
And Secretary Johnson, what's your response to that? Or
Well,
Mr. Fitzgerald, excuse me.
So I'd like to open by saying that Ms. Cromwell is currently the vice president of a country that is not delivering, and yet she's still saying that it is delivering. So honestly, with economy and business, at some point we need to decide that business owners need a say in this kind of stuff. Because obviously the government has not been putting good work in. Obviously. From the stuff we've been seeing, businesses are failing from a lack of support from the government. Business and the economy not only need the support of the government, but they need a little bit more support from underneath. They need a better baseline. We can't just keep saying, oh, come join these businesses to individual citizens. We need to start giving businesses facilities to use. They need a baseline to stand on. They need a foundation in the government.
We're going to move on to our next topic, which is community engagement. Our
Hold on,
nation
really
is much
quick.
more.
I just want to point out that this is a capitalist economy. So you sitting here and trying to put business in the government, that will never work. We are a capitalist economy.
Jesus
I'll allow
Christ, you know
Mr. Fitzgerald a 15-second response. We have to move on.
I'm just going to go ahead and say that even in capitalist economies, you do support your businesses.
We support them, but you're sitting here and trying to say that we're going to regulate them and give them buildings and everything else. We will help them out. That's not what we're saying we're not going to do. We're more than willing to help them.
Even in a capitalist economy, when your
We're-
businesses are failing, you need to send a handout.
Candidates, we have to move on. We have to get through all of the topics we have tonight. Our next topic is going to be the judicial branch. Ever since the resignation of the Asan Court in July, our nation has never seen a judicial system since. The Asan Court heard more cases than other courts combined. Secretary Johnson, will begin with you. What can be done to revive the judicial branch and to supersede the record of previous courts?
Right now, we need to find experienced justices and people who know law well that can go into justices and they can start immediately after LIA. This is something that I will give Vice President Cromwell credit. She has begun LIA courses, which will help us find judicial searches, but we need a judicial branch as soon as possible. It is a corner point of our nation, and without it, people can get away with crimes easily, which is quite disturbing to me and should be disturbing to the American people as well.
And Vice President Cromwell, your response?
Well, I want to thank him for the credit, but that's not all we're doing. When we finish LIA, we aren't nominating people to the Supreme Court. We're going to get someone in the Department of Justice once and for all. And we will be working with congressional leadership using all of the new students and past bar members to reform the entire justice system in America. Because right now it's struggling. And when we had courts in the past, they had very little to do because our laws are out of touch with BUSA, to say the least.
And Mr. Fitzgerald, what do you think can be done to revive the judicial branch and supersede the record of previous courts?
I think that both Ms. Cromwell and Mr. Johnson are very correct in that having no court is very scary, as not only will it allow people to get away with crimes, but it'll allow the government to possibly violate the Constitution and not have somebody in the way. Now, that's all well and good, but I'd also like to say that in terms of actually implementing a court, you two have said nothing. You two have said nothing about possibly speaking to Mr. Hassan or speaking to anyone who used to be on that court or speaking to anyone who may hold a bar certification about possibly helping with LIA. You've just
Well,
been
hold
saying
on
that we will do this, we
to
will
correct your
do that.
statement, because you clearly have no idea what you were talking about. I have been working in hand with the former Chief Justice Farhan Assam to complete LIA. I talked to him when I was starting the class, and I got help from him. And
That's well and good to hear, but where's the
and
transparency?
hold on,
Why didn't you tell us anything
to
about this?
correct you, it is Vice President Cromwell. Let's get that straight.
All right, Miss Vice President Cromwell, where's the transparency then? Where's the transparency? When were you going to tell us how you were running LIA then? Because the American people, all they've been seeing is, oh, we're fixing it. You can't just tell someone you're fixing the problem.
Those in LIA are completely aware of the strategies. They have the papers, the files, the notes. They have everything.
Those in LIA. So you're saying that they matter more than the American people.
They signed up to take the classes, and when I announced registration for the courses, they had the full ability to come and ask questions.
All right, now that we're on the topic of the Law Institute of America, we're going to do an ask a question about it. The Law Institute of America has long been an institution in our nation, starting with Chief Justice Helen Minervini. However, the Institute of America has long been criticized for being too selective and harsh on citizens, with a low graduation rate and a number of attorneys in our nation. With the lack of attorneys, there's a concern that there are not enough people to even revive the judiciary in the first place. We'll begin with you, Mr. Fitzgerald. What can be done to solve this drought of workers and
I,
Law Institute of America eligible citizens?
while I, as a person, I'm not necessarily acquainted with LIA, I know that when you're seeing a lack of people passing, that's usually a problem with the teachers. It can be argued that having hard tests makes it harder to get through. But even with hard tests, we should have teachers who can teach these students to be better at these things. Now, honestly, I don't know where we could get these teachers, but Ms. Cromwell, and I do commend her for this, I do admit this is a smart move. Talking to the former Chief Justice about what to do is probably the best move in the situation, and I honestly think that there should be more interfacing with other Supreme Court justices.
And Secretary Johnson, your solution?
You know, while I believe that harder tests are good, we need teachers that will be able to teach effectively to where our students will know what these tests encounter. Even if they might not know a few questions, they'll at least be able to pass them and will be able to get active attorneys in BUSA. And I agree with Duane. But also at the same time, I think that we should look because there's other people who have bar certificates still. There's still people who have them, and I think that we should also talk to them too. We should see, and talk to them about advice for what we should put in for LIA. We should take the American people's voice too, and look at what can we do with LIA to make it to where we can get more attorneys, but also at the same time keep the high level of responsibility an attorney has in BUSA.
And Secretary Cromwell, we know you may have a special interest in this as you are the director. What is your response? Vice President Cromwell, excuse me. Vice President Cromwell, I'll repeat the question. We know you may have a special interest in this as you are the director of the LIA. What is your response?
Oh, I was muted. Oops. Anyways, we are working on this. Students have their resources available. I have had several of them DM me in the past 24 hours and ask questions about their assignment. And to be honest, their current assignments are straightforward. They're straight from the notes they were provided, almost word for word, even. And they're going to be quizzed on it soon. I mean, they want to talk about making it easier, but making it easier doesn't get us good lawyers. It just gets us dumber ones.
We're going to move on to a short commercial break, and then we'll be back. Our next topic is the mass disapproval of the government. The 20th Congress failed to meet the Constitution's standards for convening. The Constitution mandates that the Congress meets once every 2 weeks. However, the last time Congress held a formal meeting was November 12th, over 6 weeks ago. To remind viewers, this Congress was under Republican control and now is under Democratic control. Vice President Cromwell, will begin with you as you are the nominee of the party currently in charge of the Senate. Why should voters trust your party to return to control over the government despite the Senate's inactivity under that party?
Look, we only got control of the Senate a week or so ago. I have been pushing the party for sessions. They keep getting put off. So yesterday, upon my advice, Senator Assan of Pennsylvania went onto the floor and completed the work of the American people. And we got things passed. And now tomorrow, after the ousting of the former majority leader, the Senate will be convening for its next in second session, in game.
Secretary Johnson, we'd like to ask you the same question, as you are the nominee of the party previously in control of Congress. Why should voters trust your party to return to control of the government despite the Senate's inactivity?
You know, Republicans have deep history in the Senate, and I entrust the candidates running on behalf of the Republican Party in the Senate. And even though we've had our shortfalls, I'll say that this session, I'm telling the American people, and I can promise this, that Republicans will deliver in the next Congress. And I'm telling this from personal experience after being president minority leader in the Senate, and from leading the SRC, that Republicans will deliver with good leadership, and good leadership is coming in, and I assured that.
Mr. Fitzgerald, as you're the only nominee that's not part of a party that has a seat in the Senate, what's your response?
Well, I'd like to begin by saying that Ms. Cromwell stated that the Democrats only gained control of the Senate a few weeks ago, but there was a considerable period in which the Democrats controlled the Senate before the Republicans regained control, and there's honestly just been a struggle between the two, but the recurring theme is that both are providing a ton of inactivity. I mean, seriously, it's pathetic.
Mr. Fitzgerald, this question is for you. Our nation's organization depends on our server, and yet 85% of our citizens say that the state of our server is poor. As Vice President, what do you believe you could do to remedy this?
While I, as Vice President, would not be able to individually control the server, that does put me in a position of influence. It would give me the ability to speak to Donald Trump, or Mr. President, about how to change the server, how to make it better. While I, as an individual, do not have much to say as to how to fix it right now, I know that there are definitely ways in which it can be adjusted to accommodate business owners, to accommodate citizens, to accommodate job seekers, and all American citizens, all of which can really only be spread through influence in the seat of the vice president.
All right, before we go to break, we'd like to allow Mr. Fitzgerald to make a brief closing statement. Mr. Fitzgerald has informed BUSA Bulletin in advance that he will not be able to stay for the entire debate due to timing. Mr. Fitzgerald, the floor is yours.
I'd like to start my closing statement by saying that I'm very, very sad that I don't get to stay for the entire debate. If it were my choice, I would have stayed here. It has been an honor to be able to stand in a debate with the Democratic and Republican candidates. It was very nice. I'm especially appreciative of the BUSA Bulletin for having me here. And just thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald, and thank you to the candidates. We'll be back in 1 minute after the break to hear from the other candidates, Secretary Johnson and Vice President Cromwell. And we'll hear their solutions for our nation's division and societal problems. Please stay tuned. We're back from the break and we're going to move quickly on to our next topic, which is cybersecurity threats. Recently, our nation has suffered a significant cybersecurity threat. The Department of Commerce was attacked with data breaches and financial losses. And there were concerns about our national security afterwards. Vice President Cromwell, this is for you. As you were vice president during this time, what has your administration done to tackle this, and what could have been done differently?
Well, just this past week, the president signed an executive order to resolve the issue. Now, at the Department of Commerce, we put a hold on any and all applications for the time being. And now that it's resolved, we have officially gutted our entire system to be able to restart and refocus and make sure that all of our data is secure and that no one else can come in and mess with it.
And Secretary Johnson, your response?
This is one topic that I will likely agree with Vice President Cromwell. I was Secretary of Homeland Security during the Trump administration's efforts to resolve the conflict, and we were able to do it with the Department of Homeland Security's help that I oversaw. We oversaw, and I have to thank Vice President Cromwell as she did help us resolve the conflict. And I believe that there is a very bright future for our nation's cybersecurity sectors.
We're going to move on to foreign policy. A while ago, our nation faced China's attempt to ruin the balance of power in the South China Sea by asserting its control. With our nation more invested in the conflict, moving to DEFCON 4, Secretary Johnson, we'll start with you. What would you have done differently?
What I would have done differently is, Buck was bound to happen. They were bound to leave us. And, there's not much that I would have done differently. There's a few things that I would have done differently. I would have reached out to Buck, and I would have had conversations, Secretary of State, and the proper officials would have had conversations with other officials of other countries. But also I'd begin exploring for other communities within Blacksburg that'd be suitable people that we can become friendships with. Right now we're internationally isolated and we don't have any allies, which troubles me, and I think should trouble every American. Is
And then we'll move on to Vice President Cromwell. Your response? I'll repeat the question for Vice President Cromwell. A while ago, our nation faced China's attempt to ruin the balance of power in the South China Sea by asserting its control. With our nation more invested in the conflict, moving to DEFCON 4, what would you have done differently in the scenario with China?
Well, first of all, I want to start with saying that I don't think Mr. Johnson answered the question at all, but that's besides the point. What we did is I worked closely with the Secretary of State and the President to resolve the issue. Now, the way it ended, I personally don't think should have happened that way, but because of pressure from BUK, the President specifically wanted to resort to certain areas to help alleviate any tensions between our two countries. Now, moving forward, BUK is no longer recognized by BUSA, and they passed something to leave our server, trying again to control their population. But what had happened here in BUSA with the South China Sea, I think I would have taken a more direct approach. We would have put sanctions. We would have put more pressure on China. And as for BUK, since I know Mr. Johnson referenced it, I say good riddance, because we have been over backwards trying to support and work with them. And in return, we got no such thing. So
We're going to move over to the topic of bipartisanship. We'll begin with you, Secretary Johnson. What could be done in our nation to improve the overall national unity and mood of the citizen?
In the Senate, I am very proud of what I did in terms of bipartisanship in the Senate. I passed many legislations with Democrats that I'm very proud of because they bettered the lives of the American people. You know, Democrats and Republicans, we have to get together and we have to be able to pass common sense legislation that will allow our country to thrive. I mean, I understand that we might not agree with all legislation. We have to agree on something because I have not seen a single bipartisan attempt by either party. And, it's kind of saddening. I've noted this to the SRC, even past the time that I resigned, that they do need to become more bipartisan. This is a problem for both parties. We need more bipartisanship in America.
Our last question is about the government shutdown. Under a Republican, then Democratic Senate, our government faced a shutdown from October to December. Vice President Cromwell, we'll begin with you. What could have been done differently, and what will you do differently as Vice President?
Well, look, what could have been done differently from the get-go was actually passing a budget instead of Senate Republicans leaving. They put the Senate in recess and left because they did not want to do the work of the American people. They did not stay and do their job. They resigned from leadership to prevent the Senate from doing anything when we returned. They have not valued the American people or the time that we put into this country. They
And
would rather let us go empty-handed than actually do anything.
we'll move over to Secretary Johnson. Your response?
While the Senate Republican Conference has had its shortfalls, especially with this government shutdown that I publicly spoke out against, I would like to note that during the recess, with all due respect to Mr. Hashan, he voted in favor of the recess, which I mean, he does not speak for all Democrats. And, the recess should have never passed, And, I think this is a problem with, the SRC, which I'm personally blaming. Because under normal leadership, it should have been better. The SRC needs to get better, but if I'm vice president, I will make sure that Republicans will never allow that to happen.
All right, we're going to move over to the closing statements for this
Well,
debate.
you want to say that we've been messing around and everything?
Vice President Alora Cromwell, I'll give you 15 seconds to respond really quickly.
Farhan Assan does not speak for the majority of the Democratic Party. While I support and thank him for his service to our country every day, he was just on his own. He was messing around. And in all regards, who cares if something was lifted? I mean, she's not a citizen of the server.
All right, we're going to move over to the closing statements for tonight. With only 1 hour for a debate, we know there are other issues important to American voters, so I'll ask you each to please use your closing statements to address any topic you may not have gotten the chance to address during the debate, and then why you are the best person to become the next Vice President of the U.S. You each have 1 minute. We'll start with you, Vice President Cromwell.
Well, look, I think it's clear the message we have sent tonight is that while we are sitting here doing work and getting things done for the American people, the two people who stood beside me tonight took a blind regard to that fact and decided to instead introduce their own policies. But what are these policies exactly? Because they did not state that here tonight. Instead, they gave the people of America false hope and false prophecy. And that's all they will ever do. So in regards to who's best fit for vice president, I've been doing the work. I've been hosting the meetings. I've been at the events. We're getting things done in America, and we're far from done. So I urge everyone to join Alora Cromwell for vice president, getting things done and standing for America.
Secretary John Johnson, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, America, for listening to this vice presidential debate. I will first point out Mr. Fitzgerald. He has great intentions in his run, but I have more experience than him, and honestly, I do not think he's fit to be vice president. At least not yet. And then let's go to Cromwell. We've had Our nation has declined under her administration. Our economy's declined. Unemployment's increased. We need, under a Johnson administration, we will improve the economy, decrease unemployment, and get people jobs. Thank you, America. Thank you, Miami. Thank you, Florida. And vote Johnson for vice president.
That will conclude our debate. On behalf of myself, I would like to thank the candidates for their time in this spirited debate. A really good, deep conversation. We appreciate you all being here. Thank you as well to our wonderful host here at WPG Stadium and to the production team, Planning Committee Chair Leor Harrison and Production Director Farhan Hassan. On behalf of everyone here at BUSA Bulletin, good night and to everyone from Miami.